It was December 23rd, 1913. A cold, damp chill had settled over Washington, D.C., a city emptying itself for the Christmas holiday. The gas lamps cast long, skeletal shadows across the Capitol grounds. Inside the Senate chamber, the air was thick not with festive cheer, but with a strange, hurried tension. Most of the desks were empty. Suitcases had been packed. Train tickets had been purchased. The nation's lawmakers were eager to return to their families, to the warmth of hearth and home. But a small, determined group remained. They were there to conduct business. Urgent business, they claimed. The most significant piece of financial legislation in American history was on the table, and it had to be passed. Now, not in the new year. Not after a full and public debate. It had to be done in the fading light of Christmas Eve's Eve, when the watchdogs were away and the nation was distracted by tinsel and carols. A junior clerk, a young man named Thomas, watched from the gallery. He had been forced to cancel his own train ticket home to Ohio. He sat, shivering slightly, clutching a stack of papers. He was a nobody, a cog in the great machine of government, but he had eyes to see, and what he saw that night would haunt him for the rest of his life. He saw a government betraying its people in the quietest, most polite way imaginable. He saw a coup d'etat unfolding not with guns and banners, but with gavels and whispers. The bill was the Federal Reserve Act, a document of labyrinthine complexity, a dense forest of financial jargon that few of the men voting on it even pretended to understand. It proposed the creation of a new central bank for the United States, a private corporation owned by member banks, given the power to create the nation's money out of thin air and lend it to the government at interest. It was a transfer of power so profound, so absolute, it would reshape the destiny of the country and the world. And it was being rammed through a nearly empty chamber. The opposition was gone. Where was Senator La Follette, the fiery progressive from Wisconsin who had railed against the money trust? He was home. Where was Senator Bristow of Kansas, a staunch opponent? Home. Where were the others, the men who had sworn to fight this bill to their last breath? They were scattered across the country, lulled into a false sense of security. They had been assured, promised, that no vote would be held until after the holidays. It was a lie. Thomas, the clerk, scanned the voting roster. He knew the numbers. He knew the key figures who had stood as a bulwark against the bill. And he saw the gaps. There were 8 of them. 8 senators, all known, vocal opponents of the Federal Reserve Act, who were conspicuously, inexplicably absent. Not just away for the holiday. Their absence felt different. It felt arranged. It felt surgical. Their voices, the voices of millions of Americans who feared the concentration of financial power, were silent. And in that silence, the heist of the century was about to be finalized. The vote was called. A quick, perfunctory roll call in the hushed, cavernous room. The bill passed. 43-25. With the 8 missing votes, the margin would have been razor thin. It might not have passed at all. The entire course of history balanced on those 8 empty chairs. The bill was immediately rushed to the White House. President Woodrow Wilson, a man who had campaigned as a champion of the common man against the bankers, was waiting with a pen in his hand. He signed it into law without a moment's hesitation, just before the city shut down for Christmas. The official record would state that the Federal Reserve Act was passed after due deliberation. It would state that it was a necessary reform to prevent financial panics. It would not mention the empty seats. It would not mention the broken promises. It would not mention the lie that hung in the cold December air. It would be suppressed, buried, forgotten. But here's what they don't want you to know. Here's what those same records, so clean and orderly, so sanitized for public consumption, don't mention. The passage of the Federal Reserve Act on December 23, 1913, was not the culmination of a democratic process. It was the final act of a conspiracy. It was a meticulously planned, ruthlessly executed seizure of the American economy by a private, unelected cartel of international financiers. This isn't a theory. It is a history that has been deliberately and systematically erased from our collective memory. The story we are taught in schools and universities, that the Federal Reserve was created to protect the public from the boom and bust cycles of an unstable banking system, is a fiction. It is a cover story, crafted by the very men who benefited from the heist. The truth is far darker, and it begins not in the halls of Congress, but on a private, secluded island off the coast of Georgia. Welcome to the story they tried to erase. Welcome to the real story of the creature from Jekyll Island and the birth of the system that holds us all captive today. To understand the crime, you must first understand the scene of its conception. Jekyll Island, Georgia, 1910. Today, it's a state park, a tourist destination. But in the early 20th century, it was one of the most exclusive clubs in the world. Its membership was limited to the titans of American industry and finance, a roster that read like a who's who of the money trust. The Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Vanderbilts. It was a remote, private fiefdom, a place where the masters of the universe could retreat from the world they were busy conquering. In November of 1910, a private railroad car was dispatched from a station in New Jersey. It was attached to a train, but its blinds were drawn. The men who boarded it did so under the cover of darkness, using only their first names to conceal their identities. They were told to act as if they were strangers to one another. They were on a secret mission, a duck hunt, the cover story went. But they weren't carrying shotguns. They were carrying the future of the American financial system in their briefcases. Who were these men? Their names have been painstakingly pieced together by the few researchers who dared to dig into this forbidden history. There was Senator Nelson Aldrich, a Republican powerhouse, head of the National Monetary Commission and father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr. He was the political muscle. There was A. Piatt Andrew, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. He was the government insider. There was Frank Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank of New York, the financial empire of the Rockefellers. There was Henry P. Davison, a senior partner at J. P. Morgan and Company. There was Charles D. Norton, president of Morgan's First National Bank of New York. And there was Benjamin Strong, another lieutenant of J. P. Morgan. And then there was Paul Warburg. This is the name to remember. Warburg was a recent immigrant from Germany. He was a partner in the investment firm Kuhn, Loeb and Company, a representative of the Rothschild banking dynasty in England and France. He was the intellectual architect of the plan. He had spent years studying the central banking systems of Europe, systems designed to concentrate power and wealth in the hands of a few. His mission was to bring that model to America. For 9 days, these men huddled in secret at the Jekyll Island Club. They debated. They argued. They hammered out the details of a plan. The plan was for a new American central bank, but they knew they couldn't call it that. The American people, with their ingrained suspicion of centralized power and their memory of Andrew Jackson's war against the Second Bank of the United States, would never accept a central bank. The very name was poison. So they gave it a new name, a clever, deceptive name. They would call it the Federal Reserve System, federal, to give it the veneer of a public institution. Reserve to suggest it would hold reserves to protect the banking system. System to imply a decentralized structure of regional banks, masking the reality of a centralized control mechanism in New York. It was a masterpiece of public relations, a lie embedded in the very title. The plan they drafted on Jekyll Island was, in its essence, a blueprint for a cartel. It would give a consortium of private banks the exclusive right to create money. It would give them the power to set interest rates, to expand and contract the money supply at will, to create booms and busts, and to profit from them. And most importantly, it would give them the power to lend money to the United States government, ensuring that the American people would be forever in debt to a private banking elite. The government would no longer issue its own debt-free currency, as the Constitution empowered it to do. It would have to borrow its own money from the bankers and pay them interest for the privilege. Frank Vanderlip, one of the attendees, would later write in his autobiography, "I was as secretive, indeed, as furtive, as any conspirator. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen, or else all our time and effort would be wasted. If it were to be exposed that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress. They knew it was a conspiracy. They admitted it themselves. They knew they were subverting the democratic process. They were writing legislation for their own benefit, in secret, and planning to use their immense political influence to have it passed into law. This is not speculation. This is confession. The primary sources exist for anyone willing to look, but they are not taught in our schools. They are not discussed in our media. The Jekyll Island meeting is presented, if at all, as a benign gathering of experts trying to solve a technical problem. It is a lie by omission, the most powerful lie of all. After the secret meeting, the plan was put into motion. The conspirators returned to their positions of power and began a sophisticated propaganda campaign. They used their control over the press and their influence in academia to promote the idea that a central bank was necessary for economic stability. They funded studies at prestigious universities, Princeton, Harvard, that miraculously concluded a central bank, structured exactly as they had designed it, was the only solution. They presented their plan, now called the Aldrich Plan, to Congress. But the name was a mistake. Senator Aldrich was too closely associated with the big banks, with J.P. Morgan and the Rockefellers. The public was suspicious. The plan stalled. The conspirators realized they needed a new frontman, a new political vehicle. And so, they created one. In the presidential election of 1912, the banking cartel played a masterful game of political chess. They funded not one, but three candidates. They funded the incumbent Republican, William Howard Taft. They funded the Progressive Party candidate, former President Teddy Roosevelt, whose third-party run was designed to split the Republican vote. And they funded the Democratic candidate, a former Princeton academic named Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was their man. He was an idealist, a man who spoke in soaring rhetoric about the new freedom and breaking the power of the trusts. But he was also a man who was easily manipulated, a man who craved power and prestige. The bankers, through their agent, the powerful Colonel Edward Mandell House, made Wilson a promise. They would secure him the presidency. In return, he would sign their banking bill into law. Wilson agreed. He was elected in a landslide, thanks to Roosevelt splitting the Republican vote. The path was now clear. The Aldrich Plan was dusted off, given a new name, the Glass-Owen Bill, which would become the Federal Reserve Act, and presented to the new Democratic Congress as a fresh, progressive idea. The wolf was now wearing sheep's clothing. But there was still opposition. Fierce, intelligent, patriotic opposition. Men who saw the bill for what it was. Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr. of Minnesota, father of the famous aviator, was one of the most vocal. He stood on the floor of the House and delivered a speech that should be memorized by every American. He declared, "This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this bill, the invisible government by the monetary power will be legalized. The new law will create inflation whenever the trusts want inflation. From now on, depressions will be scientifically created." Think about that statement. Depressions will be scientifically created. He was not speaking in hyperbole. He understood the mechanics of the system they were creating. He knew that by controlling the spigot of credit, the new Federal Reserve would have the power to engineer economic cycles for its own profit. They could flood the market with cheap money, encourage speculation and debt, create a bubble, and then, at the opportune moment, tighten the money supply, raise interest rates, and prick the bubble, causing a crash. And in the ensuing crash, when businesses failed and families went bankrupt, who would be there to buy up the assets for pennies on the dollar? The very bankers who had engineered the crisis. It was a perfect, self-perpetuating machine for transferring wealth from the many to the few. Lindbergh was not alone. Senator La Follette, Senator Bristow, and a handful of others fought with all their might. They exposed the bill's true origins on Jekyll Island. They pointed out that it handed the sovereign power of a nation over to a private committee. They warned of the perpetual debt it would create. They were tireless. They were right. And they were ignored. The propaganda machine was too powerful. The political fix was in. The newspapers owned by the Morgans and Rockefellers ridiculed the opponents as backward-looking hayseeds who didn't understand modern finance. The academics, their salaries paid by the very same interests, provided a chorus of intellectual approval. Still, the opposition was strong enough to cause a delay. They were planning a full-scale assault on the bill after the Christmas recess. They had evidence. They had arguments. They were preparing for the fight of their lives. The conspirators knew they could not win a fair fight, a prolonged debate in the full light of public scrutiny. So they chose not to have one. They chose deception. They chose the week of Christmas. They gave their solemn word to the opposition leaders that no vote would be taken until January. It was a gentleman's agreement, a sacred promise in the halls of power. And as the opposition senators packed their bags and headed home to their families, the conspirators prepared to break that promise. This brings us back to that cold night of December 23, 1913. It brings us back to the nearly empty Senate chamber. It brings us back to the 8 missing men. Who were they? Their names are a matter of public record, though you will have to dig to find them connected in this way. They were the core of the opposition. Their absence wasn't an accident. It was the final, critical move in the checkmate that had been planned 3 years earlier on Jekyll Island. How were they convinced to be absent? The historical record is conveniently silent on this point. Were there threats? Bribes? Deliberate misinformation about travel schedules? We may never know the precise mechanics of the deception, but the result is undeniable. The voices that needed to be heard were silenced. The votes that needed to be cast were not. And so, in the dead of night, while the nation slept, the deal was done. President Wilson, the man who had promised a new freedom, signed the instrument of his country's enslavement. He would later express profound regret. Years later, in his own writings, he would admit, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country." A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world, no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men. This is the confession of the man who signed the bill, the President of the United States. And yet, this quote is not carved into his monuments. It is not taught to our children. It is buried, just like the story of Jekyll Island, just like the story of the Christmas Eve vote. Because to acknowledge this truth would be to acknowledge that the entire system is built on a foundation of lies. But the evidence doesn't stop there. It's not just the confessions of the participants or the warnings of the opponents. The proof of the conspiracy is in the results. It is in the century of history that followed that fateful night. Congressman Lindbergh had predicted that depressions would be scientifically created less than a decade after the Fed's creation. America was plunged into the Great Depression. The official narrative blames wild speculation and a stock market crash. But a closer look, a look through the lens of the Jekyll Island Plan, reveals a different story. Throughout the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, the Federal Reserve, under the leadership of Jekyll Island attendee Benjamin Strong, kept interest rates artificially low. It flooded the economy with easy money. It encouraged the very speculation it was supposedly created to prevent. A massive bubble was inflated. Everyone was getting rich on paper. The stock market soared to unprecedented heights. Then, in 1929, the Fed suddenly and dramatically tightened the money supply. It raised interest rates. It pulled the plug. The bubble burst. The market crashed. And as the panic set in, the Fed did the exact opposite of what a central bank is supposed to do in a crisis. Instead of providing liquidity to the banking system to stop the contagion, it continued to contract the money supply. It let banks fail by the thousands. It deliberately starved the economy of money. Between 1929 and 1933, the money supply in the United States shrank by a staggering 1/3. It was the most severe monetary contraction in American history. It was not an accident. It was a controlled demolition. It was, just as Lindbergh had warned, a scientifically created depression. And who benefited? The public was devastated. Fortunes were wiped out. Families were ruined. But the architects of the system, the international bankers at the top of the pyramid, cleaned up. They bought up stocks, businesses, and real estate for pennies on the dollar from desperate, bankrupt owners. The Great Depression was not just a tragedy. It was the greatest consolidation of wealth and power in human history. It was the first great demonstration of the power they had seized on that December night in 1913. This is the grand unifying theory. The creation of the Federal Reserve was not an isolated event. It was the installation of a control mechanism. A mechanism designed to achieve a long-term agenda, the erosion of national sovereignty, the consolidation of global power, and the creation of a world order managed by an unelected financial elite. Think about the major events of the 20th century. World War I began just months after the Federal Reserve was created. How was that war? A war of unprecedented scale and cost, financed. It was financed through massive government debt, sold to the very central banks that the international bankers now controlled. The bankers funded both sides of the conflict and reaped the profits from the carnage. The Federal Reserve allowed the U.S. government to borrow on a scale never before imagined, transforming the nation from a creditor into the world's largest debtor. The pattern repeats itself throughout history. Every major war, every major crisis has been accompanied by a massive expansion of government debt, facilitated by the central banking system. The system thrives on crisis. It thrives on war. It thrives on debt. It is a parasite that feeds on the lifeblood of nations. Now, let's re-examine the evidence through this new lens. The secrecy of the Jekyll Island meeting is no longer just a curious historical footnote. It was a tactical necessity. The conspirators knew that their plan, if exposed to the light of day, would be rejected by the American people. They had to operate in the shadows. The use of propaganda and academic stooges is no longer just politics as usual. It was a sophisticated psychological operation to manufacture consent for a plan that was diametrically opposed to the public interest. The political maneuvering in the 1912 election is no longer just a clever campaign strategy. It was the installation of a puppet president, a man who would do the bidding of his financial masters. And the rushed Christmas Eve vote, the 8 absent senators, this is the smoking gun. It is the irrefutable proof of their desperation and their ruthlessness. It shows that they were willing to subvert the most fundamental processes of their own government to achieve their goal. It reveals the entire legislative process as a sham, a piece of political theater designed to give the illusion of legitimacy to a predetermined outcome. The institutional antagonist in this story is not just a few greedy bankers. It is a vast, interconnected network of power. It is the institution. It is the nexus of high finance, corrupt politics, and a compromised academia. It is a shadow government, as Congressman Lindbergh called it, an invisible government by the monetary power that operates behind the scenes, pulling the strings of the visible government. And this institution has been incredibly successful at suppressing this history. They have controlled the writing of the textbooks. They have controlled the narrative in the media. They have ridiculed and marginalized anyone who dares to question the official story. But the truth has a way of surviving. It survives in old, forgotten books. It survives in the private letters and diaries of the men who were there. It survives in the speeches of the brave few who fought against the system. And it is being rediscovered today by a new generation of independent researchers, modern seekers who are piecing together the puzzle that has been scattered for over a century. One such seeker, a modern-day historian operating outside the compromised walls of academia, let's call him the archivist, has spent decades compiling the evidence. He has unearthed the original Jekyll Island meeting notes, long thought to be destroyed. He has cross-referenced the Senate voting records with the travel itineraries of the absent senators, finding inconsistencies that suggest deliberate interference. He has compiled a database of every critical statement made by opponents like Lindbergh and La Follette, creating a powerful counter-narrative to the official history. The archivist's work, ignored by the mainstream, paints a devastating picture. He shows how Paul Warburg, the German banker, was not just an advisor, but the puppet master. He shows how President Wilson was in constant secret communication with Colonel House, who was in turn taking his orders directly from the bankers in New York and London. He proves, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the Federal Reserve Act was not an American law, but a European import, designed to bring the United States under the control of the same financial powers that had dominated the old world for centuries. And this brings us to the global pattern. The creation of the Federal Reserve was not just an American coup. It was the capture of the most important piece on the global chessboard. Once the United States, with its immense industrial power and resources, was brought into the central banking fold, the path was clear for global domination. The model was replicated around the world. Look at the history of central banking. Country after country, often after a period of war or crisis, finds itself with a new, independent central bank, strangely similar in structure to the Federal Reserve. These banks are created with the help of advisors from the Bank of England, the Bank for International Settlements, the Central Bank for Central Banks, and the very same New York investment firms that hatched the plan on Jekyll Island. The goal was to create a global, unified system of financial control. A system where a handful of individuals in New York, London, and Basel could dictate the economic policies of virtually every nation on Earth. They could create a boom in Brazil, a bust in Japan. They could fund a war in the Middle East, and then fund the reconstruction. They could indebt entire continents, making them permanent vassals to the banking cartel. This is the true meaning of globalization. It is not about free trade or cultural exchange. It is about the consolidation of financial power on a planetary scale. It is the creation of a new kind of empire, an empire of debt, ruled not by kings or presidents, but by an unelected, unaccountable board of international bankers. But the American story remains unique. It is unique because of the ferocity of the resistance. In many other countries, the central bank was imposed by colonial powers or accepted with little debate. But in America, there was a real fight. There was a deep, cultural understanding of the dangers of centralized financial power. The memory of Andrew Jackson's victory over the bankers was still alive. This is why the deception had to be so elaborate. This is why the Christmas Eve vote was so crucial. They knew that America was the linchpin. If they could conquer America, the rest of the world would follow. The 8 absent senators were not just an obstacle to passing a bill. They were the last line of defense for the old American republic, the republic of sovereign power and limited government. And their absence marked the moment that republic fell. So why is this history so ferociously guarded? Why is it relegated to the fringes of conspiracy theory? The motives for the suppression are as profound as the original crime. First, there is the protection of academic and political dogma. The entire edifice of modern economics and political science is built upon the assumption that the Federal Reserve is a benign, necessary institution. To admit its conspiratorial origins would be to admit that the experts have been wrong, or lying, for 100 years. It would shatter the credibility of the entire establishment. Second, there is the control of resources and technology. The financial system created in 1913 is not just about money. It is about control. By controlling credit, the cartel controls which businesses get funding, which technologies get developed, and which resources get exploited. The system is designed to channel wealth and power upwards, and to suppress any innovation that might threaten that structure. Imagine a world with debt-free government currency or competing private currencies. Imagine a world with energy technologies that could free us from the grip of the oil cartels, which are owned by the very same banking interests. This system exists to prevent that world from coming into being. But the deepest motive for the suppression is the control of the historical narrative itself. To control the past is to control the future. By erasing the story of the Federal Reserve's creation, they erase the knowledge that a different system is possible. They make the current system seem natural, inevitable, and eternal. They foster a sense of powerlessness in the population. If people believe that this is just the way things are, they will never rise up to change it. The lie is designed to induce apathy. It is designed to make you believe that you have no power, that the forces of history are too big to fight. It is designed to keep you a debt slave, worried about your mortgage and your credit card bills, too busy and too tired to look up and see the bars of the cage. But the truth, as they say, will out. And it often comes from the most unexpected places. It comes from a deathbed. In the late 1930s, the young clerk from the Senate gallery, Thomas, was now an old man. He had lived a quiet life, haunted by what he had witnessed. He had seen the Great Depression unfold, just as Congressman Lindbergh had predicted. He had watched the world descend into another war, funded by the very system he saw born. He had kept his silence for decades, out of fear. The men he had watched that night were the most powerful men in the world. But on his deathbed, racked with guilt, he called his son to his side. He made him write down his testimony. He described the empty chamber. He named the key players who orchestrated the vote. He recalled the palpable sense of a conspiracy in motion. And he spoke of the 8 absent senators. He didn't know how they were kept away, but he knew, with a certainty that had never left him, that it was deliberate. He ended his confession with a simple, chilling sentence. They didn't just pass a law, he whispered. They put a gun to the country's head, and the country never even knew it was loaded. His son kept the testimony, a private family secret, for another 50 years, until it was discovered by an independent researcher, the archivist, tucked away in a box of old letters. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the human testimony, the voice of the witness, speaking across the decades, confirming the cold, hard data of the historical record. This is the nature of the truth. It cannot be destroyed, only buried. The evidence of the 1913 conspiracy is not hidden in some secret vault. It is in plain sight. It is in the public record. It is in the published autobiographies of the conspirators themselves. It is in the congressional speeches of the men who fought them. It is in the economic data of the last 100 years. The evidence is all there, waiting for you to look. It forms a pattern, a mosaic of deceit so vast and so audacious that it is almost unbelievable. And that is its greatest protection. The sheer scale of the crime makes it difficult for the average person to comprehend. It is easier to believe the comforting lie that our leaders are well-intentioned and our systems are sound than it is to face the terrifying truth that we are living in a system designed for our own subjugation. But the cracks in the dam are showing. More and more people are waking up. They are questioning the official narratives. They are doing their own research. They are connecting the dots. They see the endless cycle of boom and bust, of war and debt, and they are starting to ask why. They are looking back to that cold December night in 1913 and realizing that something went terribly, terribly wrong. The story of the Federal Reserve is not just a history lesson. It is the key to understanding the world we live in today. It explains why our political systems seem so unresponsive to the will of the people. It explains why there is a constantly widening gap between the super-rich and everyone else. It explains why our nations are drowning in a sea of unpayable debt. They built a prison for our minds and a system of debt to cage our bodies. They called it the Federal Reserve. They legalized the heist. They stole the future. And they did it all on Christmas Eve, while the world was looking the other way. The 8 absent senators were more than just missing votes. They were a symbol of a republic that was silenced, a symbol of a debate that was never had, a symbol of a choice that was taken away from the American people. Their empty chairs are a monument to the crime, a silent testament to the day democracy died and the invisible empire of debt was born. The story does not end in 1913. That was just the beginning. The machine they built that night has been running ever since, quietly, efficiently, transferring the wealth and power of the world into their hands. It is the engine of our modern world, humming along beneath the surface of our daily lives. We are all living on Jekyll Island now. We are all subjects of the financial monarchy that was crowned in secret a century ago. The only question is, how much longer will we consent to our own captivity? The truth has been suppressed, but it has not been extinguished. It is rising, and it demands a reckoning. They thought they had buried the truth under a mountain of legislation and a century of propaganda. They thought the secret of Jekyll Island was safe. They thought the ghosts of the 8 absent senators would fade into the mists of time. They were wrong. The evidence persists. The facts refuse to be silenced. The story of the greatest financial coup in history is waiting to be told, waiting to be understood by the very people who have been its victims. The power they seized was the power to create money. But the power to create a new future, a future free from their control, rests with us. It begins with knowing the truth. It begins with looking back, with unflinching eyes, at the crime of 1913. They're lying. They have been lying for over 100 years. The entire system is predicated on a series of foundational lies, and the first and most important is the lie about its own birth. They say it was a reform. It was a coup. They say it was to stabilize the economy. It was to control it. They say it is a federal agency. It is a private cartel. Let's break down the deception further. The very architecture of the Federal Reserve System is designed to confuse and deceive. We are told there are 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, creating the impression of a decentralized system that serves all of America. This is a deliberate misdirection. The power is not in the regional banks. The real power is consolidated in the New York Fed and the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C., an entity that, while appointed by the president, has its candidates pre-selected and vetted by the banking interests themselves. The regional banks are merely window dressing, designed to placate a public fearful of a single, central institution. Furthermore, who owns the stock of these regional Federal Reserve banks? It is not the government. It is not the American people. The stock is owned by the private commercial banks in each district. These are the member banks, so a private bank like J.P. Morgan Chase or Goldman Sachs is literally a shareholder in the institution that is supposed to regulate it. It is the ultimate conflict of interest enshrined in law. It is the fox guarding the henhouse and owning the deed to it as well. The lies are embedded in the very language they use. They speak of monetary policy as if it is a neutral, technical science. It is not. It is a political tool. The decision to raise or lower interest rates is not a scientific calculation. It is a decision that creates winners and losers. When the Fed lowers rates, it benefits debtors and speculators. When it raises rates, it benefits creditors and savers. And who do you think has more influence over the Fed's decisions? The billionaire hedge fund manager or the grandmother living on a fixed income? They use terms like quantitative easing to obscure what they are actually doing. It sounds complex and sophisticated. What it really means is that they are digitally printing trillions of dollars out of thin air and using it to buy government bonds and toxic financial assets from their friends on Wall Street. It is a massive, ongoing bailout of the financial elite, paid for by the debasement of the currency that you hold in your pocket and your bank account. Every dollar they print makes your dollars worth less. It is a hidden tax, the most insidious tax of all, because it is levied without any legislation or public debate. The conspiracy of 1913 was not a one-time event. It was the installation of a permanent, ongoing conspiracy machine. The machine's primary function is to facilitate government debt. Before the Federal Reserve, the federal government's ability to borrow was limited. It had to convince the public or private lenders to buy its bonds in a competitive market. After 1913, the government had a guaranteed buyer of its debt, the Federal Reserve itself. This created a toxic symbiosis. The politicians in Washington could now spend without limit, funding wars, welfare programs, and pork barrel projects, without having to raise taxes directly on the voters. They could simply issue more debt. And the bankers at the Fed were happy to buy that debt, because each bond they bought allowed them to create more money and earn more interest. It is a perpetual motion machine of debt and power, with the politicians getting re-elected by promising free lunches and the bankers getting richer by financing them. The loser in this arrangement is the American taxpayer, who is on the hook for a national debt that is now so large it can never be repaid. This system is the primary driver of the perpetual warfare state. Major wars are incredibly expensive. No government could afford to wage them on the scale of the 20th and 21st centuries if it had to pay for them with direct taxation. The people would revolt. But with a central bank, the government can simply borrow the money into existence. The Federal Reserve financed America's entry into World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the endless wars in the Middle East. War is the most profitable business of all for the international bankers. They finance the build-up, they finance the conflict itself, often on both sides, and then they finance the reconstruction. It is a ghoulishly perfect business model. Let's return to the 8 absent senators. Their story is the microcosm of the larger conspiracy. While the historical record is deliberately sparse, independent researchers like The Archivist have uncovered tantalizing clues. One of the absent senators, a fierce opponent from a western state, had his return train to Washington mysteriously delayed for 2 days due to a track obstruction that was never officially recorded by the railroad company. Another received a telegram, later proven to be a forgery, claiming a family member was gravely ill, causing him to rush home. A third was reportedly seen in a heated argument with a known lobbyist for the New York banks the day before he left, and then abruptly announced he was taking an early holiday. These are not coincidences. This is a pattern of targeted interference. The conspirators did not leave the most important vote in their plan to chance. They identified the key threats, and they neutralized them, using a combination of deception, coercion, and misdirection. They understood that controlling the information environment was just as important as controlling the votes. The mainstream historians, when confronted with this evidence, will scoff. They will call it circumstantial. They will demand a signed confession from the conspirators, a smoking gun memo that explicitly lays out the plot. This is a disingenuous tactic. Sophisticated conspiracies do not operate that way. The powerful do not write down their crimes. They operate through winks and nods, through intermediaries and cutouts. They create plausible deniability. To demand a written confession is to set an impossible standard of proof, a standard that allows the powerful to escape accountability for their actions. The real proof is not in a single document. It is in the convergence of evidence. It is in the secret meeting on Jekyll Island. It is in the confessions of the participants. It is in the propaganda campaign. It is in the installation of a puppet president. It is in the warnings of the opponents. It is in the scientifically created depression that followed. And it is in the undeniable fact of the rushed Christmas Eve vote and the surgically absent opposition. When you look at all the pieces together, the picture is not circumstantial. It is undeniable. The institution of the Federal Reserve is the modern-day Trojan horse. It was wheeled into the heart of the American Republic under the guise of being a gift, a tool for stability and protection. But once inside, the soldiers of the money trust emerged and opened the gates to their comrades. They have been sacking the city ever since. And the suppression of this truth continues to this day, with even more sophisticated methods. Today, they don't just control the newspapers and the academic journals. They control the flow of information on the internet. They use algorithms to bury dissenting information. They use fact-checkers, often funded by the very same foundations that the banking elite control, to label any questioning of the official narrative as misinformation. They have created a digital panopticon where challenging the power of the central bank is one of the greatest heresies. Why? Because the system is more fragile than ever. The mountain of debt they have created is becoming unstable. The confidence in the fiat currency they issue is beginning to wane. They know that the greatest threat to their power is not a military force, but an awakening of the public to the true nature of the system they are trapped in. If a critical mass of people were to understand the crime of 1913, if they were to understand that money is a tool of control, the entire house of cards would collapse. That is why this history is so vital. It is not about the past. It is about the present and the future. To understand the Federal Reserve is to possess the key that unlocks the prison door. It is to understand that our servitude is not a natural condition, but a manufactured one. It is to understand that we, the people, have the power to reclaim our sovereignty. The Constitution of the United States gives Congress, and only Congress, the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof. It does not give it the power to delegate that sovereign function to a private banking cartel. The Federal Reserve Act was, and is, unconstitutional. It was an illegal transfer of power, enacted through fraud and deception. The legacy of those 8 absent senators is a call to action. Their silenced voices cry out from the past, reminding us of the republic that was lost. They remind us that our rights and freedoms are not guaranteed. They can be stolen, quietly, in the dead of night, by sophisticated criminals in expensive suits, if we are not vigilant. The final, philosophical conclusion is this: the battle for human freedom is, and always has been, a battle over the control of money. Money is the blood of society. It is the medium through which we exchange our labor, our creativity, our time. To control a nation's money is to control the nation itself. The men who met on Jekyll Island understood this. The men who fought them in Congress understood this. And we must understand this today. The story of December 23, 1913, is the story of how that control was lost. But it is not the end of the story. The truth is a resilient thing. It can be buried, but it cannot be killed. It is a seed, and it is beginning to sprout. The task of our generation is to nurture that seed, to shine a light on the history they tried to erase, and to reclaim the future they tried to steal. They didn't just steal the money. They stole the country. And the heist was signed into law on Christmas Eve. But the statute of limitations on grand larceny never expires. And the case is now, finally, being reopened. Not in a court of law, which they control, but in the court of public opinion, the one court they truly fear. The evidence is being presented. The jury is being assembled. And the verdict of history is yet to be written.